For years, Queen felt untouchable. Sold-out stadiums, songs that turned tens of thousands into one voice. A band that seemed too big to ever break. And then, without warning, Queen fell silent. Not on a stage, not after a final concert, but inside a quiet house in Kensington, where Freddie Mercury was dying, far from the noise that once defined him. The world still believed Queen was eternal. Radio stations played their songs as if time itself couldn't reach them. Fans kept arguing about albums, about legendary nights that shaped generations. But behind closed doors, very few knew the truth. The voice that carried Queen for decades was quietly fading, protected by silence, by fear, and by a choice Freddie Mercury knew would define the final days of his life. This is not only the moment Queen was no longer whole. This is also the story of Freddie Mercury and the silence behind one of the greatest voices of the century. In this film, we slow time down, stepping into the final days, the final hours, and the final decisions surrounding Freddie Mercury, and the moment Queen was forced to confront its own silence. This is where the legend begins to fracture, and where the music, for the first time, truly falls quiet. When the news broke on November 24, 1991, that Freddie Mercury had died at age 45, the reaction was immediate and immense. Headlines didn't just run in Britain. Television screens lit up in Tokyo, New York, Sydney, and beyond. Fans gathered in city squares, record stores, and radio stations. Queen's songs climbed back up the charts, and in the hours that followed, the story spread faster than any single track the band had ever released. To understand why this moment hit so hard, we have to grasp what Freddie Mercury represented. He was not just the vocalist of Queen. He was a force of nature, a symbol of flamboyance and command, a man whose presence on stage became the defining image of rock opera. For a generation, his voice was not just entertainment. It was the sound of possibility, daring, and freedom. And yet, here was a life cut short. Not by an accident, nor on a concert stage surrounded by thunderous applause. He died quietly in his home, far from the eyes of the world, the true cause revealed only hours before the announcement of his death. Many fans felt blindsided, as if a friend they had always assumed would be there had suddenly gone away. People wrote letters, lined up at tribute shows, and shared stories of the first time they heard Bohemian Rhapsody or saw Mercury perform live. DJs spoke on air with heavy voices, and some radio stations played nothing but Queen music for entire days. Across the music industry, artists expressed shock and sorrow. Tributes poured in from peers and rivals alike. There was a sense that the world had lost someone irreplaceable, someone whose talent was evident not only in record sales or stadium tours, but in the way he pushed boundaries, challenged norms, and brought untamed emotion into every note. But beyond the grief was a sudden, stark confrontation with one of the darkest realities of the time: AIDS. In the early 1990s, the virus was still heavily stigmatized. It was talked about in hushed tones, often paired with fear and misunderstanding. For someone of Freddie's stature to have battled it, not publicly, forced society to look differently at the disease and the people fighting it. Some commentators called it a watershed moment. Others saw it as tragic, unfair, and emblematic of how even the greatest performers are vulnerable to forces no one can control. In homes around the world, people paused, teardrops falling, voices faintly echoing, "We are the champions," and "Somebody to love." Not just as music, but as an elegy for a life that had meant so much. Long before the silence of Garden Lodge, Freddie Mercury lived a life defined by reinvention. He was born Farooq Bulsara in 1946, and from early on, his story carried the feeling of movement. Between places, between cultures, between versions of himself. That sense of not fully belonging anywhere didn't weaken him. It trained him. It taught him how to read a room, how to adapt, how to become whatever the moment demanded. When he entered music, he didn't arrive as someone looking for a simple career. He arrived like someone searching for a stage big enough to hold his imagination. In the early 1970s, as Queen formed, Freddie wasn't only writing songs, he was designing a universe. He wanted drama, grandeur, theatricality, not as decoration, but as identity. The microphone wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon. The stage wasn't just a platform, it was a place where the shy parts of him could be burned away and replaced by something fearless. As Queen began to rise, what made Freddie Mercury extraordinary wasn't only his voice, it was his command. He turned concerts into ceremonies, he made distance disappear. He could take tens of thousands of strangers and make them feel like a single body responding to a single breath. The world watched him and assumed that kind of power must come from certainty. But the private Freddie was not the same as the public Freddie. Offstage, he guarded himself. Interviews became performances. Answers became misdirection. He learned quickly that fame is not just attention, it is extraction. People take and take and take until the person underneath the image becomes hard to find. So he controlled what he revealed, and he turned the rest into mystery. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Queen became one of the biggest bands on Earth. Albums sold at a massive scale. Stadium tours became routine. Freddie's name became inseparable from rock spectacle itself. Yet success didn't simplify life. It complicated it. The stakes grew. The expectations grew. And so did the pressure of being Freddie Mercury every time he stepped outside. In private, his world became more compartmentalized. Relationships shifted. Trust narrowed. The circle around him changed as fame intensified. The more myth he became to strangers, the more carefully he protected the parts of himself that were still human, still vulnerable, still tired. This matters because it explains something essential about the final chapter. The same instincts that made Freddie brilliant, control, performance, reinvention, privacy, also shaped how he faced decline. The story of his last moments isn't separate from the story of his rise. It's built from it. When we rewind, we don't just see a legend being created. We see a man learning how to survive the spotlight. And we begin to understand why, when the spotlight finally became unbearable, he chose to step away from it on his own terms. By the late 1980s, the world around Freddie Mercury had grown harsher. The press was sharper. Rumors moved faster. And the AIDS crisis cast a long, unforgiving shadow over public life. For someone who had always guarded his inner world, exposure wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Queen kept working, but the rhythm changed. Touring slowed, then stopped. Freddie's last live performance with the band came in August 1986 at Knebworth Park. After that, the stadiums went dark. To the public, it looked like evolution, a band choosing the studio over the road. Inside the story, it was also a signal that energy had become finite and protection had become essential. Speculation followed him everywhere. Freddie answered it the only way he knew how, with deflection and distance. Interviews turned theatrical. Personal questions were rerouted or laughed away. In an era when HIV/AIDS was still framed as scandal before sickness, silence became a form of control. Not denial, control. Biographies and accounts commonly place his HIV diagnosis in 1987, though precise details were kept private. What mattered more than dates was what followed. Access narrowed. The inner circle tightened. Garden Lodge became less a home than a perimeter, designed to keep the world out and preserve what autonomy remained. And still, he worked. Freddie returned to the studio with urgency. Sessions were arranged around stamina. Vocals were captured when strength allowed. The music from this period carries a peculiar tension, songs that sound triumphant, recorded under the pressure of time. It was creation against the clock, not to chase charts, but to leave something complete. Public appearances grew rare. When Freddie did step into view, it was carefully chosen. His final public appearance came in February 1990 at the Brit Awards, where Queen accepted an honor for their contribution to British music. He spoke little. The moment passed quickly. Then the doors closed again. From there, the collapse was not dramatic. It was methodical. Privacy hardened. Routines simplified. Decisions were made with one question in mind: what preserves dignity? The same instincts that built the legend, control, performance, reinvention, now shaped decline. This is the hinge of the story. Not the end yet, but the narrowing. The point where the distance between the man and the myth becomes too wide to maintain. Where silence stops being strategy and starts becoming necessity. What follows is not a fall from a cliff, but a descent down a steepening path. Weeks and days where every choice grows heavier, and time, once abundant, begins to close in. By the time November 1991 arrived, Freddie Mercury's world had contracted to something almost startling in its simplicity. The grand machinery of touring, publicity, and public life had been replaced by one address, one routine, one guarded perimeter. Garden Lodge in Kensington wasn't just where he lived. It became the boundary line between Freddie the icon and Freddie the man trying to stay in control of how his life would end. Outside, the atmosphere grew tense. In the final weeks, the British press pushed harder, speculation sharpened, and photographers waited for proof that rumor had become reality. Inside, the response was not chaos. It was discipline. Access tightened, conversations quieted, and the people around him became less a staff and more a protective circle, those who could be trusted to keep the end from becoming a spectacle. Reports and accounts consistently place his partner, Jim Hutton, and longtime confidant Mary Austin among those closest to him in this period, along with trusted support figures such as his personal assistant, Peter Freestone. What makes these final weeks so emotionally heavy is not a single dramatic event. It's the accumulation of small, irreversible signals. Freddie appearing less. Freddie conserving energy. Freddie choosing privacy over reassurance. The outside world kept playing Queen songs and arguing in headlines. Inside the house, the reality was quieter and more intimate. A body weakening. A room becoming a world. And a man deciding, day by day, what he would still give to the public and what he would keep for himself. And still, the work mattered. Even as his health deteriorated, it's widely reported that Freddie continued recording with Queen for as long as he could, pushing through pain to lay down vocals that would become some of his last. The song Mother Love remained unfinished by him, a detail that feels almost unbearable because it sounds like time itself interrupted the session. In the background, the era's stigma made every choice heavier. In 1991, HIV/AIDS was still surrounded by fear and misunderstanding, especially in mainstream media coverage. For Freddie, fiercely private, fiercely protective, revealing the truth too early meant surrendering control to a world that would treat illness as scandal. So he held the line. Then, in the final days, the pressure outside Garden Lodge reached a breaking point. On November 23, 1991, a statement was released in his name, confirming he was HIV positive and had AIDS, explaining that he had kept it private to protect those around him. It was calm, direct, and unmistakably final, because it arrived only a day before his death. That timing changes everything about how we view the last stretch. It reframes the quiet not as avoidance, but as intention. Freddie wasn't disappearing. He was choosing the terms of his final chapter. And now, with the truth finally spoken aloud, the story tightens into its most haunting form. The house is sealed. The circle is smaller than ever. The world is listening. Too late. And the last 24 hours are waiting, not as legend, but as a sequence of real moments, real breaths, and real decisions that lead to one irreversible end. By the time dawn broke on November 24, 1991, Freddie Mercury was no longer living in the world that knew his name. Garden Lodge, the house that had protected his privacy for years, had become a closed system. The gates stayed shut. The curtains remained drawn. Inside, there was no sense of a future, only the careful management of the present. According to those closest to him, Freddie's condition had declined rapidly in the days leading up to that Sunday. His body was severely weakened. Breathing had become labored. Bronchial pneumonia, brought on by AIDS, had taken over what little strength remained. The decision had already been made that there would be no hospital transfer, no public intervention. He would remain at home, where control and dignity were still possible. The house was quiet in a way that only places at the edge of life ever are. There was no music playing, no television noise. Conversations, when they happened, were brief and low. The people inside understood that every sound, every movement cost energy that Freddie no longer had to spare. What's important to understand about these final hours is not what happened minute by minute, but what didn't happen. There was no dramatic rally, no sudden surge of strength, no final message prepared for the world. The idea of a last performance existed only in memory. What remained was a human body reaching its limit and a small group of people focused on comfort rather than hope. Freddie spent most of that day resting. Sitting up for long periods was difficult. Speaking required effort. Accounts consistently describe exhaustion so deep that even small interactions had to be measured. This was not the theatrical decline often imagined in stories about famous deaths. It was slow, physical, unavoidable. Those present later spoke of an atmosphere that was calm but heavy. There was no panic, no rush, just an understanding that time had narrowed to hours and that nothing outside the house mattered anymore. The outside world, press speculation, fan concern, radio tributes, had not yet broken through the walls. As evening approached, Freddie's condition worsened. Breathing became more strained. Energy faded further. Those closest to him gathered, not for ceremony, but because it was clear the end was near. Exact details vary, and accounts are careful not to overstate what can't be proven. What is consistent is this: Freddie Mercury died peacefully on the evening of November 24, 1991, at Garden Lodge, with people he loved close by. He was 45 years old. There were no recorded final words released, no statement written in anticipation of death. The last public communication, the acknowledgement of his illness, had already been made the day before. After that, nothing more needed to be said. Immediately after his passing, the response inside the house was controlled and deliberate. The doors remained closed. Privacy was preserved. Queen's representatives and family prepared the announcement that would soon travel across the world. Outside, time continued as normal. Inside, it had already stopped. This is the part of the story that resists spectacle. There is no mystery hidden in shadowed corners, no secret revelation waiting to be uncovered. The truth of Freddie Mercury's final 24 hours is quieter and harder to face. A global icon, stripped of performance, reduced to breath and presence, choosing stillness over display. When the news finally broke, the world would react with shock, grief, and myth-making. But inside Garden Lodge, none of that existed yet. There was only the aftermath of a life that had burned intensely, ending not in noise, but in silence. And in that silence, something irreversible happened. The voice that had defined generations was gone, not on a stage, not under lights, but in a private room, far from the roar that once followed him everywhere. The silence inside Garden Lodge didn't last long. When the announcement reached the public on November 24, 1991, it moved like an electrical surge through newspapers, television, and radio. Freddie Mercury was dead at 45. The cause, bronchial pneumonia resulting from AIDS, turned private suffering into public fact in a single line of newsprint. And almost instantly, the story split into two realities. One was grief. Pure, overwhelming grief. Fans gathered outside Queen-related landmarks, outside record shops, outside the gates of the home they could not enter. Radio stations filled the air with Queen songs that suddenly sounded different. Lyrics that once felt like celebration started to feel like goodbye. In the UK, Bohemian Rhapsody surged back to #1 in the weeks that followed, as if the country was trying to hold on to his voice by turning the volume up. The other reality was interpretation. In the early 1990s, AIDS was still wrapped in stigma. The announcement didn't just confirm a diagnosis, it forced a wider public to confront how easily illness had been turned into rumor, judgment, and spectacle. The media asked questions that sounded clinical but carried moral weight beneath them. Why had he kept it secret? Who knew? How long had he been sick? What had the band known? The most revealing fact wasn't a date. It was how quickly the world tried to take ownership of an ending that Freddie had worked so hard to keep private. Behind the headlines, the immediate aftermath remained controlled. His funeral was private. Details were limited. The boundary he built in life stayed in place in death. Even the handling of his remains became part of the story. Reports and later accounts consistently note that Freddie wanted his ashes kept in a secret location, entrusted to Mary Austin, and that she honored that wish, keeping the location private even years later. Then came the world's attempt at a collective response. In April 1992, Queen and a constellation of artists staged the Freddie Mercury tribute concert for AIDS awareness at Wembley Stadium. It wasn't only a memorial. It was an event with a purpose: to turn grief into attention, and attention into action. It drew tens of thousands in the stadium, was broadcast widely, and helped launch the Mercury Phoenix Trust to fight HIV/AIDS. Yet even with tributes, the questions didn't vanish, because the tension at the center of the story never resolved. Freddie Mercury was a public figure who died a private death. The world wanted a narrative it could hold, a clean explanation that fit inside a headline. But Freddie's final chapter refused that simplicity. It was too controlled, too quiet, too intentionally sealed. So what remained, long after the funeral and the tribute concert, was a lingering unease that sounds less like conspiracy and more like human frustration. The feeling that the world arrived one day too late, that the truth only came when it could no longer help, that the icon who had lived in the loudest possible way chose to exit the world almost invisibly. And maybe that is the most haunting aftershock of all. Not what the cameras missed, but what Freddie protected. Not what the world never learned, but what it was never entitled to know. In the days and months after Freddie Mercury's death, the world searched for closure in familiar ways. Albums were replayed, performances were mythologized, quotes were pulled from old interviews and made to sound prophetic. It was comforting to believe that meaning could be recovered by looking backward. But Freddie's legacy didn't crystallize in a single moment. It spread. His voice continued to circulate, not as nostalgia, but as presence. Queen's music reached new listeners who had never seen him on stage, and older fans heard familiar songs reframed by loss. The band itself carried on, careful not to replace him, but to honor what had been built. Tributes came from every corner of popular culture, not only because Freddie was famous, but because he had expanded what a frontman could be. Beyond music, his final chapter reshaped conversations that had long needed confronting. The AIDS crisis, still burdened by stigma at the time of his death, gained renewed visibility. The Mercury Phoenix Trust became a lasting instrument of advocacy, turning attention into resources and remembrance into action. What had been hidden by necessity in life became a catalyst for awareness in death. And yet, perhaps the most enduring part of Freddie Mercury's legacy lies in what he refused to surrender. He showed that control over one's story is not weakness, that privacy can be a form of strength, that a public life does not obligate a public ending. In his final hours, he chose stillness over spectacle, intimacy over exposure. That choice complicates the myth, but it humanizes the man. Looking back from the vantage point of his last moments, the arc becomes clearer. A life lived at maximum volume did not require a loud goodbye. The performance ended where it began, with intention. Freddie Mercury did not disappear into legend. He stepped out of it. What remains is not a mystery to be solved, but a presence to be felt. Whenever a song begins, whenever a voice rises beyond what seems possible, whenever art refuses to be smaller than the person who made it. The world did not lose Freddie Mercury in a single night. It continues to find him, again and again, in the sound he left behind.